Okay, so let's dive into one of the most dramatic, chaotic, and honestly, most important periods in American history. We're talking about a time when unimaginable wealth and progress existed right alongside shocking poverty and corruption. This is the story of the Gilded Age and the incredible wave of reform it sparked, a progressive revolt that totally forged the America we know today. And it all really starts with millions of individual stories like Sadie's. Just try to put yourself in her shoes for a second. You're 13 years old. You've just crossed the Atlantic and you sail into New York Harbor and see the Statue of Liberty for the first time. For so many people, that wasn't just a statue. It was everything. It was this powerful symbol of hope, a promise of a brand new life. But here's the thing. That beautiful, shining promise, it slammed right into a very harsh reality. That land of opportunity, well, it often meant working brutal 12-hour shifts for wages you could barely survive on. And that dream of a better future? For many, it was spent crammed into these unsanitary tenement buildings where diseases like cholera just ran rampant. It's this huge, jarring gap between the dream and the reality that really sets the stage for everything that's about to happen. And this whole era of wild contrasts got a perfect name, a phrase that just completely captures the feeling of the time: the Gilded Age. Yeah, the one and only Mark Twain came up with it, and it is so spot on. Think about what gilded actually means. It's when something is covered with a super thin layer of gold to make it look valuable. But underneath, it's usually a much cheaper, less impressive material. And that right there was Twain's point. America had this shiny veneer of incredible wealth and amazing progress, but if you scratch the surface, you'd find some really deep systemic problems. I mean, just listen to Twain's own words here. The sarcasm is just dripping. He's describing a government so corrupt that investigating its own members for bribery was just a normal part of the process. It wasn't a huge scandal, it was just business as usual in Washington. And what was fueling all this change? Well, a truly mind-boggling explosion in the population of cities. I mean, just look at these numbers. In just one generation, the number of people living in American cities multiplied by 5. You had new tech like the steam engine, letting factories pop up everywhere, and that acted like a giant magnet, pulling millions of people from farms and from all over the world into these crowded, chaotic new urban centers. But as you can imagine, this kind of explosive growth came with a massive human cost. For one, the presidents during this time were pretty weak, often pushed around by powerful political bosses who ran the spoils system, giving government jobs to their buddies. And at the same time, out in America's heartland, farmers were getting crushed. They were growing more food than ever, but that actually made prices crash. And to top it off, they were getting gouged by the railroads, who had a total monopoly and could charge whatever they wanted. The cracks in that shiny, gilded surface were getting wider and wider. But here's the thing. Americans didn't just sit back and take it. Nope. All across the country, from the cornfields of the Midwest to the crowded streets of New York, a powerful movement started to bubble up from the ground. It was ordinary people deciding it was time to demand some real change. And this wasn't just one single event. It was more like a chain reaction. It started small, with farmers creating groups like the Grange to fight back against the railroads. That energy snowballed into the huge Farmers' Alliance, which then morphed into a real political party, the Populist Party. And all of that laid the foundation for the massive society-wide progressive movement that would follow. Now, a huge spark for this fire came from a new type of journalist, the muckraker. President Teddy Roosevelt actually made up that name as an insult, believe it or not. But these reporters, they totally embraced it. They wore it like a badge of honor. Their whole mission was to dig through all the muck of society and drag the ugliest truths out into the daylight for everyone to see. And let me tell you, their work had a huge impact. Jacob Riis published these haunting photos of life in the tenements, and it just shocked the wealthy folks who had no idea people were living like that. Ida Tarbell spent years meticulously investigating John D. Rockefeller, and her work helped lead to the breakup of his company, Standard Oil, the biggest monopoly on the planet. And then there's Upton Sinclair. His novel, The Jungle, was so disgusting, so stomach-churning, that it horrified the public and led directly to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. So while the muckrakers were exposing all the rot, another group of reformers was on the ground actually building something new, and women were at the absolute center of this. Leaders like the amazing Jane Addams and Florence Kelley started something called the Settlement House Movement. These were basically community centers in immigrant neighborhoods offering things like childcare, healthcare, and classes to working families who had absolutely nowhere else to go. Sooner or later, all of this energy, all of this demand for change had to go somewhere, right? Well, it washed all the way to Washington, D.C., and through a really wild twist of fate, it found its biggest champion in the most powerful office in the land, the White House. And it happened by complete accident, seriously. When President McKinley was assassinated, his vice president, a young, energetic guy named Theodore Roosevelt, suddenly became president. And the old school party bosses who had stuck him in the VP job just to keep him quiet and out of the way, they were horrified. Their whole plan just backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Roosevelt came into office with a totally new philosophy he called the square deal. See, for decades, the government had pretty much always sided with big business. But Roosevelt said, no, the government's job is to be a neutral referee to make sure everyone, workers, consumers, and businesses, gets a fair shot. This was a radical idea at the time. And he wasn't just talk. He got the nickname the Trust Buster for a reason. He went after the biggest corporate giants in the country, including guys like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. When a huge coal strike threatened to shut the country down, he didn't just send in troops to break it up. He dragged both sides to the White House and forced them to make a deal. Nobody had ever seen a president do that before. On top of all that, Roosevelt was a passionate outdoorsman, and he used his presidential power to protect America's natural wonders. Get this, during his time in office, he put a staggering 230 million acres of land under federal protection. That includes creating 150 national forests. Just an incredible legacy of conservation. And the progressive train didn't stop when Roosevelt left office. The next president, Woodrow Wilson, a former professor, brought his own ambitious reform plan to the White House. He called it the New Freedom. Wilson had this very clear three-step plan. He wanted to attack what he called the triple wall of privilege: tariffs, banks, and trusts. So first, he lowered tariffs to make things cheaper for regular people. Second, he created the Federal Reserve System to bring some stability to the country's banking system. And third, he made the antitrust laws even stronger, giving the government more power to break up monopolies. So after all of that, all the protests, the investigations, the new laws, what was the end result? Well, it was nothing less than a complete reinvention of what the American government was supposed to do. This era marks a massive shift in thinking. The country moved away from this laissez-faire or totally hands-off approach to an activist one. For the very first time, there was this expectation that the federal government should be an active regulator of the economy and a protector of the people. It's probably the biggest change in American politics of the entire 20th century. And the victories were huge, tangible things that reshaped American life. We got federal laws to make sure our food and medicine are safe. New workplace safety laws were passed after horrible tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And democracy itself got a major upgrade. The people got the power to elect their senators directly. And of course, after a long, hard fight, women finally won the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. This quote from Upton Sinclair just sums up the whole era perfectly, doesn't it? He wrote The Jungle because he wanted to expose how badly immigrant workers were being treated. He was aiming for people's hearts. But what really got the public's attention was the disgusting stuff going into their sausages. He hit them in the stomach. But hey, it worked. The public outrage led to real, lasting change. So what the Gilded Age and the Progressive Revolt really show us is that when Americans are faced with huge new challenges, they can completely reshape their country to meet them. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. What are the major forces shaping our world today, and how are they forging the government of our future?